I stood in my own living room, looking at my son David and his fiancée Rachel, when she said the words that would change everything. "We voted and decided to cancel your invitation to the wedding. You can keep the $60,000 deposit." Welcome to the Mental Grand, where we talk about justice, dignity, and the moment when silence becomes the most powerful weapon you'll ever hold. My name is Robert Mitchell. I'm 62 years old, and I spent 40 years building Mitchell properties from the ground up. I started with one rental house in Pittsburgh and turned it into a portfolio worth $12 million. I raised David alone after his mother passed when he was 8. I gave that boy everything: private schools, college without loans, a brand new Audi when he graduated, a junior partnership position in my company that he didn't earn, but I gave him anyway because he was my son. And this is how it ends, with his fiancée standing in my house, her arms crossed, telling me I'm not welcome at their wedding, while my son stands behind her like a coward, unable to meet my eyes. Let me back up 6 months so you understand how we got here. David met Rachel at some tech startup mixer in downtown Pittsburgh. She worked in marketing for a software company, came from what she called old money in Connecticut, and made it clear from day one that she thought my success was somehow beneath her family's inherited wealth. The first time I met her, she looked around my house, a beautiful 4,000 square foot colonial that I bought with my own sweat and tears, and said, "It's charming, very nouveau riche." I let it slide because David seemed happy, and I hadn't seen him smile like that since his mother died. The engagement happened fast. 4 months after they met, David came to Sunday dinner with a ring already on Rachel's finger. No asking for my blessing, no conversation about their future, just a done deal presented to me like a business memo. Rachel immediately started planning what she called the wedding of the century. She wanted the Omni William Penn Hotel, she wanted 200 guests, she wanted an orchestra, imported flowers, a designer dress that cost more than most people's cars. The budget started at $80,000 and climbed every week. That's when I realized something was changing in my son. He stopped coming to the office regularly, started missing meetings with tenants and contractors. When I asked him about it, he said Rachel needed him to focus on wedding planning and that the family business could wait. Family business, the company I built with my bare hands that provided everything he ever had, was suddenly just something that could wait. But I'm his father, so when Rachel presented me with the wedding budget and looked at me expectantly, I didn't hesitate. I wrote a check for $60,000. It was supposed to cover the venue, the catering, and the florals. Rachel took that check, smiled for the first time since I'd met her, and said, "This is exactly what we needed. Thank you, Robert." Not Dad, not Mr. Mitchell. Robert, like I was some investor in their little production. The next few months were a masterclass in watching my son disappear. Rachel had him going to cake tastings, meeting with wedding planners, touring venues every weekend. My calls went to voicemail. Our Sunday dinners stopped. When I did see David at the office, he was distracted, always checking his phone, always rushing out early. I asked him once if everything was okay, if maybe they were moving too fast. He looked at me with this cold expression I'd never seen before and said, "Rachel says you're being controlling. She says you can't handle that I'm building my own life." Building his own life. On my money, in my company, living in a condo that I helped him buy. But I held my tongue because I believed that love makes people stupid temporarily, and eventually David would remember who raised him. The warning signs kept coming, but I missed them because I didn't want to believe my own son could betray me. Rachel started making comments at the business at family gatherings. She'd say things like, "It's such a shame that Mitchell Properties is still so old-fashioned. David has such modern ideas." Or, "I'm sure when David takes over, he'll really bring the business into the 21st century. Take over. Like I was already dead. Like the 40 years I spent building something from nothing meant it should just be handed to her ambitious plans. Then came the rehearsal dinner planning. Rachel insisted on inviting her entire extended family, including cousins she'd mentioned she hadn't spoken to in years. When I looked at the guest list, I noticed something strange. My brother Tom wasn't on it. Tom, who had been David's godfather, who had helped me raise that boy after Sarah died, who had been there for every birthday and graduation. I asked David about it, and he got defensive immediately. He said Rachel felt the wedding should be intimate, family only, and Uncle Tom was just extended family. I reminded him that Tom was more of a father to him sometimes than I could be when I was building the business. David just shrugged and said, "It's Rachel's day, Dad. She gets to decide." That's when I should have seen it clearly, but I still had hope that my son was in there somewhere beneath whatever spell this woman had cast. The real breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at the office going over some property acquisitions when my assistant Jennifer buzzed me. She said David and Rachel were in the conference room and needed to speak with me urgently. I walked in thinking maybe they wanted to discuss honeymoon plans or perhaps ask about giving David more responsibility in the company. I was actually hoping for the latter. Despite everything, I still wanted to believe we could work together, that I could teach him what I knew before I retired. Rachel was sitting at the head of the conference table, my conference table, in my building. She had a folder in front of her and this expression on her face like she was about to fire an employee. David sat next to her, staring at his hands. I sat down and asked what was so urgent. Rachel opened the folder and slid a piece of paper across to me. It was a printout of an email chain. She said, "Robert, we need to talk about your behavior." I looked up the email. It was a conversation between me and David from 2 weeks prior, where I'd asked him to handle a tenant complaint at one of our properties. I'd been direct in the email, telling him he needed to take responsibility and stop delegating everything to the property managers. It wasn't rude. It was a boss talking to an employee who wasn't pulling their weight. I looked at Rachel, confused. She continued, "David has been feeling very attacked and disrespected by your management style. We've been documenting these incidents." Documenting? Like I was some kind of criminal. I looked at David, waiting for him to say something, to defend me, to explain that this was just business. He wouldn't look up. Rachel kept talking. "We've discussed this with a family therapist and several of my family members, and we've come to a decision. For the sake of David's mental health and our upcoming marriage, we think it's best if you take a step back from both the business and the wedding planning." I felt something cold settle in my chest. I asked her what exactly she meant by step back. She said, "We think David should have full operational control of Mitchell Properties effective immediately. You can remain as a silent partner, of course, but the day-to-day decisions should be David's. And as for the wedding, we've decided that your presence is causing too much stress. We've voted, David, myself, and my parents, and we think it's best if you don't attend." The room went silent. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, and waited for him to tell her she was insane. Instead, he finally looked up at me and said, "Dad, you have to understand. This is what's best for everyone. You're too controlling. You always have been. Rachel's family has shown me what a real supportive family looks like, and I need that right now. You can keep the $60,000 as a gift, but we don't want you at the wedding." What happened next wasn't anger. It wasn't even hurt, though that would come later. It was clarity. Crystal clear, cold clarity. I stood up from that conference table, looked at both of them, and said one sentence, "I understand completely." Then I walked out. Jennifer asked me if I was okay as I passed her desk. I told her I was fine and that I needed her to call my attorney, Marcus Chen, and tell him I needed an emergency meeting within the hour. Then I called my accountant, Patricia Rodriguez. Then I called my brother, Tom. By 5 p.m. that evening, I was sitting in Marcus's office with my entire business documentation spread across his conference table. Marcus has been my attorney for 23 years. He knew every detail of how Mitchell Properties was structured because he helped me structure it. When I told him what happened, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Robert, I'm sorry this is happening, but I have to ask, what do you want?" I said, "I want to know exactly where I stand legally with the business and what options I have." He smiled, not a happy smile, but the smile of a lawyer who knows he's about to deliver good news. He said, "Well, David's in for a rude awakening." Here's what Rachel and David didn't know, because they'd never bothered to actually understand the business they wanted to take over. Mitchell Properties wasn't just some company where David was a junior partner. The entire business was held in a trust that I had established 15 years ago when David was still in high school. The trust was structured so that David would inherit full control, but only under specific conditions. He had to work in the business for a minimum of 10 years. He had to demonstrate financial responsibility, meaning no major debts or bankruptcies. And most importantly, any transfer of control required my approval until I either died or voluntarily stepped down. David had been working in the company for 6 years. He didn't qualify for control yet, and given his recent behavior, he never would with my approval. But here's the beautiful part that Marcus explained to me. Because David was technically an employee and junior partner, and because he just attempted to force me out of operational control of my own company, I had grounds to terminate his partnership and his employment for attempting a corporate coup. It wouldn't just be firing my son, it would be protecting my business from someone who'd proven they couldn't be trusted. Patricia, my
approach. She turned on the tears, the whole performance. She said, "I'm sorry, Robert. This was all a misunderstanding. We never meant to hurt you. We just wanted to start our life together. And I thought you'd want to step back and enjoy retirement." I almost laughed. Instead, I said, "Rachel, you're 28 years old. You've never built anything in your life. Everything you have came from your parents. You met my son and saw a man with access to millions of dollars, and you decided that should be yours. But you made one critical mistake. You assumed I was weak because I loved my son. You thought my love made me a target. You were wrong." Marcus laid out the terms. David's partnership in Mitchell Properties was terminated, effective immediately. He was being sued for the $38,000 he'd stolen, plus damages. If he wanted to avoid criminal charges, he'd sign a separation agreement that prohibited him from working in property management or real estate in Pennsylvania for 5 years, and he'd cooperate fully in returning any confidential documents to the company. He'd also resign from the board of 2 charitable foundations I'd gotten impositions on, because I wouldn't have a thief representing organizations I supported. The wedding could go forward, but they'd have to plan it themselves, in whatever venue they could afford with 72 hours notice and on their own dime. The condo David lived in, which was titled in my name with him as an occupant, would need to be vacated within 30 days. The Audi I'd bought him, still titled in the company name, would be returned immediately. Every connection to me, every benefit of being my son was severed. Rachel's father tried to negotiate, tried to throw money at it, tried to make it go away, but Marcus had structured everything perfectly. The evidence was airtight, the lawsuit was filed, the only question was whether David would sign the agreement and accept a civil penalty or refuse and face criminal prosecution. Rachel was crying real tears now, not the performance from before. She was realizing that her perfect wedding, her perfect life, her perfect plan had collapsed because she'd underestimated the man she was trying to destroy. David signed the papers. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely write his name, but he signed. Rachel's parents promised they'd make this right financially, but everyone in that room knew the truth. It didn't matter how much money they threw at this. David had burned a bridge that couldn't be rebuilt, and Rachel had hitched herself to a man who just lost everything. As they left the conference room, David stopped at the door. He turned back to me and said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. Can we please just talk about this?" I looked at my son, and for a moment I felt the grief I'd been holding back for 2 weeks. Then I remembered him standing behind Rachel in my conference room, refusing to meet my eyes while she told me I wasn't welcome at his wedding. I said, "David, you voted to remove me from your life. Consider your vote respected." The wedding happened, sort of. I heard through the grapevine that they'd scrambled and found some restaurant with an event space that could accommodate them on short notice. Instead of 200 guests, they had about 40. Instead of an orchestra, they had a DJ. Instead of imported flowers, they had whatever the local florist could provide with no notice. Rachel's parents paid for all of it, probably trying to salvage their daughter's reputation among their country club friends. But here's what money can't fix. The story got out. In business communities, especially in a city like Pittsburgh, people talk. The story of David Mitchell trying to force his father out of the family business and getting caught embezzling spread fast. Suddenly, David wasn't a promising young real estate developer. He was the guy who tried to steal from his own father. Every time Rachel's parents went to their country club, people were whispering. The perfect society wedding they'd imagined became the scandal of the season. As for me, I went back to work. I promoted Jennifer, my assistant who'd been with me for 12 years, to David's old position. She'd actually gone to school for business management, but had started as my assistant because that's where the opening was. Within 3 months, she was handling everything David had fumbled and doing it better. The company didn't just survive without David, it thrived. Tom asked me once, about a month after everything went down, if I regretted how hard I came down on David. I thought about it carefully before answering. Then I told him the truth. I said, I gave David every advantage in life, every opportunity, every benefit, not because I wanted him to be dependent on me, but because I wanted him to have the foundation to build his own success. And when he had the choice between honoring that or betraying me for someone who saw dollar signs, he chose betrayal. I didn't destroy David's life, I just stopped funding it. Everything that happened after was his own doing. 6 months after the wedding, I heard that David and Rachel had separated. Apparently, when the money and the lifestyle disappeared, so did Rachel's interest in being married to David. She'd moved back to Connecticut, and David was working in insurance sales, trying to rebuild some kind of career outside of real estate because of the non-commit he'd signed. I don't take pleasure in that, but I don't feel guilty either. Tom asked me once, about a month after everything went down, if I regretted how hard I came down on David. I thought about it carefully before answering. Then I told him the truth. I said, I gave David every advantage in life, every opportunity, every benefit, not because I wanted him to be dependent on me, but because I wanted him to have the foundation to build his own success. And when he had the choice between honoring that or betraying me for someone who saw dollar signs, he chose betrayal. I didn't destroy David's life, I just stopped funding it. Everything that happened after was his own doing. 6 months after the wedding, I heard that David and Rachel had separated. Apparently, when the money and the lifestyle disappeared, so did Rachel's interest in being married to David. She'd moved back to Connecticut, and David was working in insurance sales, trying to rebuild some kind of career outside of real estate because of the non-commit he'd signed. I don't take pleasure in that, but I don't feel guilty either. Tom asked me once, about a month after everything went down, if I regretted how hard I came down on David. I thought about it carefully before answering. Then I told him the truth. I said, I gave David every advantage in life, every opportunity, every benefit, not because I wanted him to be dependent on me, but because I wanted him to have the foundation to build his own success. And when he had the choice between honoring that or betraying me for someone who saw dollar signs, he chose betrayal. I didn't destroy David's life, I just stopped funding it. Everything that happened after was his own doing. 6 months after the wedding, I heard that David and Rachel had separated. Apparently, when the money and the lifestyle disappeared, so did Rachel's interest in being married to David. She'd moved back to Connecticut, and David was working in insurance sales, trying to rebuild some kind of career outside of real estate because of the non-commit he'd signed. I don't take pleasure in that, but I don't feel guilty either. Tom asked me once, about a month after everything went down, if I regretted how hard I came down on David. I thought about it carefully before answering. Then I told him the truth. I said, I gave David every advantage in life, every opportunity, every benefit, not because I wanted him to be dependent on me, but because I wanted him to have the foundation to build his own success. And when he had the choice between honoring that or betraying me for someone who saw dollar signs, he chose betrayal. I didn't destroy David's life, I just stopped funding it. Everything that happened after was his own doing. 6 months after the wedding, I heard that David and Rachel had separated. Apparently, when the money and the lifestyle disappeared, so did Rachel's interest in being married to David. She'd moved back to Connecticut, and David was working in insurance sales, trying to rebuild some kind of career outside of real estate because of the non-commit he'd signed. I don't take pleasure in that, but I don't feel guilty either. Tom asked me once, about a month after everything went down, if I regretted how hard I came down on David. I thought about it carefully before answering. Then I told him the truth. I said, I gave David every advantage in life, every opportunity, every benefit, not because I wanted him to be dependent on me, but because I wanted him to have the foundation to build his own success. And when he had the choice between honoring that or betraying me for someone who saw dollar signs, he chose betrayal. I didn't destroy David's life. I just stopped funding it. Everything that happened after was his own doing. 6 months after the wedding, I heard that David and Rachel had separated. Apparently, when the money and the lifestyle disappeared, so did Rachel's interest in being married to David. She'd moved back to Connecticut, and David was working in insurance sales, trying to rebuild some kind of career outside of real estate because of the non-commit he'd signed. I don't take pleasure in that, but I don't feel guilty either. Tom asked me once, about a month after everything went down, if I regretted how hard I came down on David. I thought about it carefully before answering. Then I told him the truth. I said, I gave David every advantage in life, every opportunity, every benefit, not because I wanted him to be dependent on me, but because I wanted him to have the foundation to build his own success. And when he had the choice between honoring that or betraying me for someone who saw dollar signs, he chose betrayal. I didn't destroy David's life. I just stopped funding it. Everything that happened after was his own doing. 6 months after the wedding, I heard that David and Rachel had separated. Apparently, when the money and the lifestyle disappeared, so did Rachel's interest in being married to David. She'd moved back to Connecticut, and David was working in insurance sales, trying to rebuild some kind of career outside of real estate because of the non-compete he'd signed. I don't take pleasure in that, but I don't feel guilty either. My brother Tom suggested once that maybe I should reach out, see if David had learned his lesson, maybe offer some kind of reconciliation. I asked Tom a simple question. I said, if David had succeeded in taking the business, if I hadn't caught the embezzling, if he'd actually managed to force me out, do you think he'd be calling to check on me now? Tom didn't have an answer for that, and that was answer enough. Here's what I learned through all of this, and I want you to really hear this because it matters. Respect isn't about blood. It's not automatically granted just because someone is your child or your family. Respect is earned through character, through loyalty, through standing by the people who stood by you. David thought being my son entitled him to everything I'd built. He thought my love meant I'd accept any betrayal, any disrespect, any humiliation, because fathers are supposed to forgive everything. But there's a difference between forgiveness and being a doormat. There's a difference between love and letting someone destroy you. I loved my son, and maybe part of me always will love the boy he used to be. But I respected myself more than I loved who he'd become, and that distinction saved me. The business I built didn't just represent money or success. It represented 40 years of sacrifices, 40 years of working 70-hour weeks, 40 years of missing school plays and soccer games because I was trying to build something that would give my son a better life than I had. And when Rachel looked at all of that and saw nothing but something to take, and when David looked at all of that and agreed with her, they weren't just betraying me. They were disrespecting every sacrifice, every hour, every moment that went into building something meaningful. So I protected it, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. And if that makes me hard or unforgiving in some people's eyes, I can live with that. Because at the end of the day, I can still look at myself in the mirror. I can walk into my office knowing that everything there is mine because I earned it, not because I manipulated or stole or betrayed to get it. That's worth more than any relationship built on lies and greed. If you've stayed with me this far through this story, if you've understood why I did what I did, then I want you to do something for me. I want you to like this video and subscribe to The Mental Grand, because stories like this matter. They matter because they remind us that dignity isn't negotiable. They remind us that respect has to be earned. And they remind us that justice, real justice, doesn't always come from courts or lawyers, though sometimes it does. Sometimes justice comes from simply refusing to participate in your own destruction. Comment below and tell me if you think I was right to stand my ground, or if you think I should have handled things differently. I'm genuinely curious about your perspective, because I know some people will think I was too harsh on my son. But I also know that many of you have been in similar situations. Maybe not with a business worth millions, but with family members who took advantage of your kindness, who mistook your love for weakness, who thought they could disrespect you without consequences. This is The Mental Grand, and we tell these stories because someone needs to say what too many people are afraid to say. You don't owe anyone access to your life, your success, or your peace just because they're family. You don't have to accept betrayal with a smile just because someone expects forgiveness, and you absolutely do not have to let anyone vote you out of your own life. I'm 62 years old now, and Mitchell Properties is stronger than it's ever been. Jennifer is being groomed to eventually take over when I'm actually ready to retire, and unlike David, she's earning it every single day. Tom and I have dinner every Sunday, and we talk about real things, honest things, not the performative family gatherings Rachel used to demand. My life is quieter now, smaller in some ways, but it's mine. Every piece of it is mine because I refused to let it be taken. That's the lesson here. Not revenge, not cruelty, just a simple refusal to accept disrespect. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them. And when they try to take what you've built, what you've earned, what you've sacrificed for, stand your ground. Not with anger or violence or petty vindictiveness, but with the calm, quiet certainty that you deserve better. David made his choice. He chose a woman who saw him as a meal ticket over a father who loved him. He chose betrayal over honor. He chose greed over loyalty. Those were his choices, and the consequences were his to bear. I didn't punish my son. I simply stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own actions. And sometimes that's the most loving thing a father can do, even if it doesn't feel like love in the moment. So, hit that subscribe button for The Mental Grand. Share this story with anyone who needs to hear it. And remember that your dignity, your self-respect, and your life's work are not negotiable. Not for anyone, not even for the people who share your blood. Especially not for the people who think your love makes you an easy target. Thank you for watching, and remember that justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like a man standing in a conference room watching the people who betrayed him realize they made a terrible mistake. And sometimes that's enough.